Hello, and welcome to Bloomberg Opinion Conversations. I'm Nicole Torres, an editor at Bloomberg Opinion based in London, and I'm joined today by Allison Schrager, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and the author of the wonderfully titled book, An Economist Walks into a Brothel and Other Unexpected Places to Understand Risk. Allison, hi, and thanks for chatting.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right into it. You wrote a column that published yesterday arguing that in some ways, millennials could be considered the wealthiest generation. And I think that surprised a lot of people, myself included, because it seems to fly in the face of the typical narrative that we hear, which is that millennials are the unluckiest generation. So are we actually better off financially than our parents and our grandparents were at our age?
Yeah, in a lot of ways they are. I mean, I think what people have to understand is that the world changes. You know, we're living in a very different world than the 80s or in the 50s and 60s when our grandparents were growing up. And so millennials have largely responded to this different world and made different choices and made different investments. And when you look, I think, at a more inclusive definition of wealth, that you actually see that those choices have paid off for them and just make a lot more sense for them.
Mm. But isn't there data showing that millennials, at least in the US, have more debt and have fewer assets and even make less money than previous generations? Like, how does all of that square with us as a whole being better off? Where do millennials come out ahead?
Well, they do have more debt, but that is all student debt mostly. That is where most of the debt is where the big discrepancies are. But the thing is, student debt is actually an investment in your future earnings. In economics, we have this concept called human capital, which is, how much your earnings are worth, not only now, but in the future. So you can think about your future earnings as like a bond that pays off. And when you get more education, the value of that bond increases, right? Not only does it go higher, but it also becomes less risky, because you're less likely to be unemployed for a long period of time and you have more predictable wages. So you have that more valuable bond. So when you think about taking on student debt, you're making an investment. And I mean, it's not guaranteed. Some people take on student debt and it doesn't pay off, but for most people it does. So when you include this thought of human capital, that debt doesn't look so bad. And we do see that millennials are generally out earning their parents. Now, there are some caveats on that, which I think is why the data is a little confusing. Is that the college wage premium has certainly gone down from what was in the 80s. In the 80s, a lot less people have been to college, so it's a lot more valuable. It's also a lot more necessary now to have an advanced degree. I mean, you could debate whether it actually is necessary to do the job or if it's just signaling, and that's a valid question. But in terms of really making it in the economy, you need higher education, but a lot more people have it. So if you condition on being a college graduate, you're not out earning high school graduates as much as you used to. And that is true. And I think that's also a reason why a lot of times you look at these studies and they compare a 24-year-old to a 24-year-old. And you can't compare a 24-year-old who'd been in the labor market for 6 years in 1989 with a 24-year-old who's just graduated college and has their first job. What we see with college graduates is wages rise much faster and they become a lot more stable.
Okay. So, but just going back to this narrative of, woe is me, millennials, what has gotten harder or more expensive for, us as a generation?
Well, certainly housing's gotten a lot more expensive, and that's a really valid complaint. But again, that is also making an investment in a sort of a choice. There's this whole theory, the Richard Floridas of the world, of these sort of creative clusters you need to be part of to get ahead. And most of the good job opportunities, we also see this with David Otter's work, that if you live in a big metro area, your wages rise much faster. You develop a network, the better jobs are there, they pay more. You also develop a network of friends and co-workers who really make you more creative and more productive and also help you find another job when you want to. But those people all live in cities. But that's also where housing is more expensive. So it's not surprising that millennials are facing higher housing costs. They're living in more expensive areas than their parents did. But that's also them making an investment in their human capital, and not necessarily a bad one.
So these are following choices that millennials are making.
Yeah, and I think smart choices that, millennials should get credit for.
So in the column, you mentioned that wages have become more stable in part due to people changing jobs less frequently and also working less. But what about the rise of, precarious labor like gig work and independent contracting and shift work in the service industry, things that were really pummeled in the pandemic? It seems like if you look at those, if you think about those trends, that if anything, work has become less stable and more demanding, but maybe there's something else going on and there's just more inequality between people who have more stable work and can work comfortably from home, for example, versus people who cannot.
There certainly is more of a divergence there, but it's actually all this gig work and shift work and this perception that people are changing jobs all the time just really isn't borne out in the data. I mean, it's sort of been a puzzle for economists because we could think of a lot of reasons why people would want to do more shift work or why it's become more of a big deal, all this workplace fissure and all these platforms. But when you look at the data, there hasn't been a huge increase in gig work. And actually what we find is when you look at this data, people do gig work largely as a side hustle. And that could be either to supplement wages or even act as wage insurance. Like if you do have a job where, you know, someone cuts your shift and you pick up more money working for Uber, then that actually works as some form of insurance. Mm-hmm. So most people actually do it as a side hustle, which might be why we're not seeing these huge shifts to gig work. And another reason why wages have become more stable.
So related to that, I just want to get your thoughts on this. So the other week, there was this tweet going viral that said, unpopular opinion, the best thing young people can do early in their careers is to work on the weekends. Mm-hmm. So do you think that millennials and Gen Zers should be working beyond normal hours of their jobs to stay ahead? Should they be, you know, supplementing their income or trying to get income insurance by taking on additional work and side gigs?
I mean, that's up to them. You know, a lot of people in these surveys claim they enjoy this. Actually, most of these side gigs involve actually technically selling things online. So it's not necessarily, you know, working, you know, driving all sorts of night shifts on Uber. I think really whether or not you should work weekends depends on you, this level of your ambition, and really the needs of your job. For some millennials, certainly, you know, they talk a lot about the experience. They value lifestyle, they value experiences more, and, you know, maybe they're willing to be on a slower track job for that. And we actually do see a lot of evidence that people work fewer hours than they did a couple decades ago. So, I mean, again, that probably is contributing to the more stable wages. Mm-hmm. So if that's the lifestyle people want, they should do it. I mean, I think it's really about making choices that are right for you. And if you are a lot more ambitious and you are willing to sort of really want to see your wages go on that faster track, then you should work weekends. But there's no shame in either.
Mm. But is there, I guess I've seen like a lot of, there's a typical narrative around, you know, there are millennials who can make those choices. They can work harder if they want to, they can supplement their income if they want to, but then there also, it seems to be this group of millennials that do not have as many options or opportunities. Like you said, like there is just a need for more jobs. There is a requirement in more jobs to have a college education. So it seems like there's this group of people that doesn't necessarily have the same choices. And is this just a sign of more inequality among millennials compared to previous generations, or what?
So you mean sort of jobs that don't require, I mean, there's evidence that people all up and down the income distribution, mainly anyone not in the top percentiles, are working fewer hours. That might be because they have fewer or being offered fewer hours, or because a lot of jobs, you know, have irregular shifts, so it's hard to supplement it. I mean, that might be a reason why things like Uber become a very attractive side hustle, because you can choose when you're working your side gigs. But generally, people are working less. And it's not entirely clear, and something we have to understand better, how much of it is by choice and how much of it is by circumstance.
Yep. So millennials are also a much more racially diverse cohort than previous generations, especially in the US. So how does this affect like the picture of our wealth overall?
Well, I mean, if you're a member, most minorities are less likely to receive an inheritance from their parents. So if, you know, we have a larger percent of the population not getting an inheritance, although most people never got an inheritance no matter what race they were. It's just whites were more likely to get one. Then we would see people going on the labor market with less wealth, less ability to have a parent help them buy a house, all those sorts of things. But it also speaks to maybe we'll also have a more inclusive economy, where everyone, no matter what background they're from, will also get a shot at having sort of a well-paid job and a chance to start building retirement assets and all of those nice things.
So you study retirement. In your column, you wrote that 86% of millennials have some kind of retirement plan, compared with 73% of boomers at their age. And I found this really surprising. So can you just talk about how you're defining these retirement plans, and how is it that millennials are managing to save when they are still so saddled with debt?
Well, so what I did is I looked at any sort of retirement plan, either defined benefit or defined contribution, according to the Survey of Consumer Finances. And the thing is about defined benefit plans, those traditional pension plans that people used to have, we tend to romanticize them a lot, but they really had a lot of problems. One is that they're incredibly expensive for firms to offer. So they stopped offering them in the early 80s. So baby boomers were actually the first generation to really get a defined contribution plan, but they were still a little bit less common when they were millennials age now. So defined contribution plans like 401ks, 403bs are a lot cheaper to offer. So employers are a lot more likely to offer them. Like at their peak, only 30% of people had defined benefit plans. And to be honest, they're only worth a lot if you spend your entire career with one employer. Now, millennials change jobs less frequently, but they're also less likely to eventually settle into a very long-term job where defined benefit plans are valuable. So it's not clear that they really would benefit from having one. And the fact that now more people have access to some form of retirement savings is better. I mean, while millennials have more student debt, you often look at, often the numbers we see are net worth, which is assets minus debt. But the thing is, that does not include the human capital. Again, the higher wages millennials get and have made that investment. Because when you just look at financial assets, just what's in their bank account, what's in their retirement accounts, millennials actually do have a little bit more because they have all this retirement savings that their parents didn't have at their age.
And you put it really well in your column, I thought, when you explained how, just as the world has changed a lot since the 80s, so have our values and priorities. Maybe saving for retirement has become one of them. Mm-hmm. But what are some things that have changed?
Well, I think, again, I think millennials want more work-life balance. There's evidence that they're putting off having children because they want to be more financially secure. Boomers had kids. I mean, I think as well, we have this expectation that you have a child when you're completely financially secure, when you have your house, when you have a stable job. Boomers just sort of went for it and had kids in their early 20s and just sort of, winged it. And we don't do that. And, you can argue whether or not that's good or bad. I think that's a personal choice. I mean, certainly, people who have children in a more financially secure place tend to report higher levels of happiness and certainly have an easier time. But I mean, I guess you're more tired too. So, I mean, there's trade-offs. So I think that does also reflect a shift in values and certainly maybe a shift in societal expectations of the resources necessary to raise a kid, which people before didn't think were necessary.
Yeah. But I guess the question is, was it easier to reach that financial security before? Boomers could have had an easier time just saying, okay, yeah, we'll have a family now, even though we're not perfectly there financially. Whereas now there's a lot more consideration. I want to wait until I'm so certain I'm financially secure before starting a family. Is that all choices or is that, circumstantial? Was it easier before to kind of take those risks?
It's not like boomers were that financially secure either. As I said, they had actually less savings. They did have less student debt and they were more likely to own a home, but they also had mortgages. They had jobs that paid them more variable wages. I mean, if we go back to the 70s, they faced incredibly high inflation and unemployment. So it's not that millennials now face this untoward risk that earlier generations did not. I think it's more that we have higher expectations as a society of what tolerable risk is. And we just are willing to tolerate less risk. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying millennials are snowflakes who can't handle risk. I mean, society naturally does evolve to become less tolerant of risk. Boomers were less tolerant of risk than their generation too. It's just society evolves and we've evolved to a point where less risk is tolerable. So if you face any risk, it feels just completely overwhelming.
Yeah. And something I thought about when I was reading your column, which I think gets lost in the typical narrative about, what a terrible deal that millennials get, is would I or other millennials that I know choose to go back and live in previous decades? I think there are a lot of reasons why many wouldn't, mobility, technology. We have the internet now and access to as much information as we want. I'm just wondering, what are some other things that we should keep in mind that might help us realize, millennials as a group are not so terribly off?
Yeah, quality of life is certainly a lot higher. I mean, I think even little things like air conditioning and refrigerators and TVs, are a lot more accessible. So quality of life is certainly higher. And as I said, we do have a lot more stability in some ways. I mean, we're freaking out about 4 or 5% inflation. I mean, people used to live with 8% inflation. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, how much that erodes your earnings? There was a lot more financial uncertainty actually back then. So we do have a lot more stability, a lot more certainty. And as I think also more awareness of how important equality is. And certainly while things might have looked good on paper for a lot of people in the 80s and a lot in the 70s, it was very terrible for a lot of people. And I don't think we really realized that and gave that due attention.
Yeah. So one of I laughed at seeing this. I was on Twitter looking at tweets of your article, which basically said, forget what you've heard. Millennials are actually, pretty well-off generation. And someone commented on that tweet saying, but the narrative, and it struck me that, complicating this narrative was maybe, a big motivation for writing this column in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I just want to ask, what do you want people to take away from this and from your argument?
I mean, I think we should give millennials credit. I mean, they get a lot of crap for being, told like that they're irresponsible and
much crap.
They're put upon, and they can't get ahead, and they're living this prolonged adolescence. But really, I think they're just making good choices. I think they live in a different world where, as I said, living in a city and not owning a home and maybe waiting to have kids, those are valid choices and actually might make more sense in the economy we're living in. Mm-hmm. And, maybe they would feel a little bit less stressed if they're just told, you know what, you're doing okay. That student debt shouldn't represent a burden to you, even if it certainly does feel like it financially sometimes. But you should take it for what it is that you made an investment in yourself, in your skills. And that was a very smart investment to make.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Allison. And thank you all for watching. I think it's probably about time for us to wrap up. So you can follow Allison on Twitter at Allison Schrager and read her columns at Bloomberg Opinion by looking her up at Bloomberg.